Hello, everyone. Welcome to Lauchdarkly's Fireside Chat. For those of you that don't know who I am, my name is Jessica Craig. I am Lauchdarkly's UK-based developer advocate. And for those of you that don't know us or what we do, Lauchdarkly is the #1 feature management platform. We enable technology for teams to ship code faster and more safely. We do that by decoupling the deployment and the release process. So we give technology businesses the power to turn on and off features within 25 milliseconds of any segment across users within any application. And this helps you de-risk and bring precision to the last mile of your software release process. If you've got any questions, we've got lots of our friends on the call, so feel free to ping any one of us. But first off, let's do a bit of housekeeping and just make sure that we're setting everything off in the right tone. So first off, if you feel comfortable enough, please keep your cameras on. I can see lots of you have, which is awesome. It's great to see your faces. But we want to keep everything really interactive and discussion led. So if you have any questions for Edith or Patrick, please put these in the chat and we'll see your name and hopefully your company name afterwards. If you can just change that in Zoom as well so we can know who the questions are coming from. And lastly, for anyone who was in the first 50 slots of registration, a copy of the second edition of the DevOps Handbook is currently on its way to you. So I am personally very jealous. If you have any questions regarding your book, please direct these to Rachel Jones. Her email address, I think, will also be in the chat. So you can look out for that. But let's just get on with the conversation today. So let's meet our two special guests. So first off, we have Patrick Debois. So he's credited, in his words, with accidentally coining the term DevOps, along with the inaugural DevOps Days event series. His work on the DevOps Handbook, the second edition of which has just been released, has earned Debois the title of the godfather of DevOps. I hope that's not too overused by now. But yeah, it's a pleasure to be in your company, Patrick.
Well, thanks for having me, Jessica. It's a pleasure to be here. And to everybody on the call, appreciate being here.
And we're also joined with our very own co-founder and CEO of Lauchdarkly, Edith Harborough. Welcome.
Great. We're super excited to have Patrick here today. We've seen the release of the DevOps Handbook's second edition. You said you just got the PDF to give a final read through, but can you enlighten us on some of the big learnings or what we can look forward to in the new edition?
Of course, yeah. There's, I think there's even more stories to convince people, especially from the bigger organizations, which, a lot of the early book had some stories, but now, you name it, the company has done DevOps. So that fear of it's only working for the smaller companies or the startups is taken away. So use that to convince your boss, right? Definitely. There's a new part a little bit more on DevSecOps, which is another trend we try to incorporate. Another part is like how SRE fits into the metrics and monitoring kind of thing. With Nicole Forsgren and kind of her work on Accelerate being more integrated. So yeah, there's a lot of tweaks, a lot of extra stories that people can look into this, like a refresh on the existing one, and then new stories that have been added to make it more like globally acceptable. So
yeah, I would argue that DevOps is actually even more important at a big company than at a startup.
Well, it depends. Like, if you're a big company and you can survive without DevOps, it's not that important, right? I remember this argument somebody had with a CEO, and they said like, "Hey, this DevOps things, should we do it?" And I know that person tried to really explain that to the CEO and said, "Oh, so we get some benefits. I get that, but what if we just raise the price? That's the same benefit." So it shows you, like, if you have the pain, and the pain is your communication across the silos, that could be both in your startup, and it could be the survival of your startup if you're doing it wrong, and it could be the survival of your big company. I think what the difference is that doing the cultural change with 5 people might be easier than doing it with 4,000 people. So, and that's kind of, if you're on the pod and you spend your money, there's a lot more money spent in a big organization. So the benefits are probably potentially bigger if you turn the ship around, as kind of is mentioned in the book, if you have those pain points. But it might be slower because there's a lot of gravity around different pain points in the company. So the statement of, is it more important for the bigger ones? Well, not if you can afford that, but if that's, the threatening of your existence and employees, definitely you're on the line and you should consider this. So,
yeah, I mean, the analogy I give is, it's like, do you want to be Netflix or do you want to be Blockbuster?
That's true, but again, that's more of a market thing, and I think there's different market strategies on whether you're a niche or a specific or whatever you want to do. And I think something I learned in my previous startup is, even if you got like all the DevOps philosophy in your technical team lined up and they understand, you have your pipeline, you have your collaboration, if there's no market fit, good luck, right? There's no business. So I try to explain that it will take you up to a certain level, but it's not per se a guarantee that your business succeeds, because there's other things to consider in a company. And like what I learned, and I don't want to like detail on this too much, but I thought I had this DevOps thing figured out in my startup and how to do this and how to set this up. But I learned that like when I solved that bottleneck, I had a bottleneck on getting cash flow, on hiring people, on kind of financial services, on like all the other parts. And they also like suffer from some silos or not collaborating. If marketing is not listening when the engineers are building, or the other way around, we have another silo. So I just found out that like the technical implementation, or like the view people have on looking at how to do things better, is not a guarantee on like the business success. It will add, but be aware that that might not be your bottleneck in your company.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point. It reminds me a lot of, it's a methodology, not a cure-all.
Yeah. And we kind of joked about before on Star Wars acronyms and Jedi and just enough, being the two letters of Jedi. But I think there's another thing, like if you do anything, you look and you get better, but then you have to see whether your bottleneck has moved. And sometimes I get the impression that teams, they go like completely all in on this one problem, but they're not constantly reevaluating whether that is actually their biggest problem. And it could be in clouds, right? People say like, I'm going to put the cloud up to a level which is insanely good, like, but then it's bleeding through somewhere else, maybe security or another aspect. So the metaphor that I try to use for describing it is, I think, like a barrel. You have the sides, but if one of the sides is leaking water below the level of the others, that's the one that needs plug-in. And there's no benefit of having like one side up until the top. So it's kind of like you always go around looking at all the aspects to improve them incrementally in that way.
Yeah, so I'm the founder and CEO of Lauchdarkly, and we've been around for almost 8 years. It's always, you're kind of looking around the barrel, like what needs help right now.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
But of the new case studies in the book, what were some of your favorite ones?
I kind of get that question, and I'm not dodging the question, but I don't have a specific favorite company story. But I do have, like, there's two parts of the story, all stories that I like. There's the first part or act, which is, oh, Houston, we have a problem, right? And that's kind of the first thing in many of the stories. Like, we identified there was a problem. And what I like there is the approach of mapping the problem out. Like, you get together with people from different departments, from different groups, and you start discussing. And that's why I like the visual kind of workflow mapping and kind of that style. And not because you just have the visual map. It is about the conversation and the initial point of getting people to talk to each other. So usually that results to communication and this aha moment of, hey, it seems we're hitting here, and this is the first thing we need to solve, right? So that's kind of an act that I really love. And then usually kind of goes into like muddied water, like one company has this bottleneck, the other one has that one. So it's hard to tell, but usually, you know, the stories revolve on like, hey, let's build a pipeline, let's put some automation, let's get some metrics over there. But that's kind of like universal. And then as much as I like the first part, the last part is about, hey, we got to a stable position. How do we keep improving this process? And that kind of second aha moment or like level that you've reached is also an interesting one, because again, that depends so much on the culture, whether you're looking actively to improve your way to improve and not just looked at, we solved this, we done DevOps, checkbox, what's next, right? So kind of those are the two, let's say, favorite acts in the story. Like the first one is the discovery, and the second one is when you discover you need to continuously learn or have a method for learning. So
yeah, you talked about org structure and communication. The book references Conway's Law, which, basically a team's design will echo its communication structure.
mm-hmm.
In this remote first async world, how do you think that works?
I always bring up the story about when people say, hey, this remote first thing, and how does it work? I've done much work in the open source, and it has always been distributed with people across the world. And there has been collaboration, and we were not sitting next to each other. So what people don't always see is that the communication doesn't always need to be the face-to-face talking. I could read things into how you do your PRs or what comments you make on a chat, or I would read that as different ways of communication. And it's that culture of always being supportive in those methods that can be very similar. And it doesn't mean I have to kind of be in the same room, which is not what I'm not saying is there is no need for kind of a frequent communication, so it can be like async and longer term. But it usually helps to have like a cadence, but it's the same thing. You're working on a PR, and you'd love to have feedback. If the feedback takes you kind of 2 months, right, you're just going to abandon that feature, or you're just going to go through. But it's that supportive same thing that will work. And whether that's through one of the Slack tools or the Zoom and so on. So I prefer to be almost always on if I can. And personally, I am a big fan of things like mob programming, where the team is always on, like no matter what the task, we're all working on the same task. And I think maybe that's kind of almost the extreme of people working together when they're needed. And the PR review is not an async thing anymore. We're all the time reviewing. But I also understand that that's not for all parts of the job. But I think the seeking of feedback is similar. This reminds me of a discussion I had about services and using SaaS, right? A couple of years ago, I saw the movement of things moving to Amazon. And if you're a company or a startup, everybody tells you, don't build it yourself. If it's not the core of your product, just use something else that's like doing it for you. And it made me think about, is this the end of DevOps, right? We're just going to outsource everything to a third-party service, and they're not sitting next to us. Like, how can that work? But the secret is actually the type of communication changed. Yesterday, the outage of Amazon, right? The first thing they'll learn is we need a good overview of communication, what is working, what is not working. So it's the first thing they learn. That's a different way of communicating. The second one is they need to improve their support system, right? To give feedback. The reason why you're paying a support contract is actually to talk to people. It's just because that's the differentiator. They will listen to you and they will kind of like try to understand your problem. And that's what you're paying for. It's not just because they're solving. Another way of communicating that I think, for example, Lauchdarkly does, you go to conferences, you talk about this stuff, you listen to user feedback. So those are all the ways that companies can communicate, even though you're not in the same company, right? You're two parts. Like, I cannot tell Amazon what to do. I cannot tell Lauchdarkly what to do. Kind of, I'm an end user. I will give feedback. You will give me feedback back. So in that way, I think communication is just shifting how we think about this. But of course, the stronger relationship you build, and the tighter you do your communication, the better. And I think it's almost like in a lot of the DevOps narrative, we think about what happens in our own company. But I think we forgot the supplier part. Like, a SaaS service is a supplier in a way that we also have to think how we collaborate with those people. Open source libraries are a form of supplier. We need to have a way to communicate with them. And that's kind of shifts the way. They're already async. And I think the main difference is they're not within our authority. Like, we cannot control them. Maybe we still think that dev and ops we can control in our own company and we can put them together. Guess what? The trend is autonomous teams, and people are even getting afraid from telling autonomous teams what to do. So that's kind of already muddling the waters internally. But imagine it's outside. You still have to build those relationships. And I think that's a lot where it's heading, is that you build a relationship with the vendor, you build a relationship with the library, like the ecosystem you're working in. And that's kind of how you do your communication. And it's async or sync, right? Different ways of tackling the same problem. But if there's no communication, there cannot be the trust and the buildup that you're doing. So,
yeah. I thought you made a really interesting point in there about basically if a feature doesn't get communicated on and if it's stale for 2 months, it's probably extremely unlikely to get shipped at all.
Yeah, that's true. What I heard from some more, of the experienced developers is it's an art as much as to add features to it than it is to remove features from the backlog. Like the features aren't used, or if we're over engineering stuff, that art of not doing something is sometimes really hard. And in code, we sometimes talk about code complexity, like, do you still understand the code? And I think there's a similar thing in architecture. Like, do I still understand all the pieces that are working here, or can I simplify this? And maybe that's kind of, I felt that really hard when I was dealing with mobile services in that way. Like, I couldn't always get control, but there was like a spread of tools that I could use in that system. And I think it's even mentioned a little bit in the book about you have continuous integration, continuous delivery, and then there's like almost continuous re-architecturing or removal of things. Is it still the one that's needed? And it's very similar to what I talked about if you look at the bottleneck, you find the first one, then probably it moves. And it's the same thing in a feature. This feature is relevant today. Can I evaluate whether it's still relevant? If I add something, does it add something? Or did I just make it because I needed to crank out features? And it's that same mentality, like, do I allow people to be idle? Or do I want them to add more features? So, hey, we ship more features. That should not be the goal. The goal should be like what we add, is it bringing value, or is it like, fixing a problem by simplifying stuff in there?
Yeah, I I completely agree. I think there was some false metrics in the past of like lines of code, which like, well, you shouldn't really be measuring lines of code. It should be value to a customer.
I'm going to generalize this to anything you measure is probably somewhere along the line falsely measured. I think it's one of those paradoxes. Like the more you get excited about monitoring, the more you're monitoring, the less you're actually monitoring. And there's many of those paradoxes. Like the more you automate, right, the less you understand what it actually is doing. Because after a while, you don't know anymore what the automation did. Like I sometimes give the example on people build these insane pipelines, like delivery pipelines. And they're meant to be making everything robust. And then I asked them the question, so tomorrow, if your pipeline does not work, do you trust the people to do the right thing manually? And then they wonder like, oh, did we actually train the people or educate the people to do the right thing? Or did we try to build a buffer that's like a fail-safe and we didn't really, we abstracted that away so they shouldn't worry about that stuff. So anyway, it's kind of like this, enough understanding of what's going on and the basic understanding. And you can take away some of it with abstraction, but, it's always a risk if nobody understands the abstraction, and whether that's your database abstraction, your cloud abstraction, it doesn't matter. After a while, people start wondering like, what's happening in here? Like we don't understand.
I mean, I think we've talked for an hour just on that. There's of any advanced science is indistinguishable from magic. We're having this chat right now over Zoom.
Yeah, insane.
From multiple time zones apart. Well, to get us back to DevOps and less philosophy, the latest State of DevOps report from the DORA team, amongst its findings, highlighted the rise of SREs. Mm-hmm. And I think this is interesting because, SREs are something that kind of came out of Google and we're now we're seeing more and more. What is your reaction to this? And also any thoughts around the DORA report at all?
Any publication, any sharing that's improving the field is great for me, right? I know some people say, well, is it now, should we do SRE or should we do DevOps? Or again, I don't mind too much. It's kind of the practices. I think the differentiator there might be some part of it being, Google wants to grab a piece and saying, hey, we were doing this first. Okay, that's fair. They probably had like problems before anybody else at that scale. I think what they brought, at least that's, from a philosophy point of view, they had like the similar views. The stories tend to skew towards, I brought metrics to the table. It was okay that it wasn't perfect. We put boundaries around what is perfect, like is it okay, not okay, and they went a lot of the measurement train, like we're putting boundaries, we're metrics, and that's what we're going to use to kind of improve, to know where our bottleneck is. Obviously they put like you build it, you run it in, not in the Amazon way, but they kind of probably extrapolated that as well, like you take over, there's not really a handover, there's a soft kind of a more of graduation of a project that an SRE takes on and kind of like moves it toward production. And kind of the practices they brought out were great, right? They're a good addition for people to look at. I've seen SLOs also being applied in version updates between Kubernetes. So it doesn't always have to be like your typical monitoring thing, like uptime or not uptime. So it's kind of this mentality, like there's boundaries, we stay in these boundaries, and then we kind of close the boundaries and we get better at this. Interesting enough, in the DORA report, they also mentioned we kind of made improvements on things like burnout in like due to this improvement. Obviously, I wasn't there, so I can't judge, but maybe it's an extrapolation to what happened in the DevOps world as well. Like, I tend to have a different origin on why I got into DevOps. And a lot of people got into it to improve their business and to get like better results or like faster to production. I came out of it from being in love with the agile teams and the human treatment and the people treatment. And for me, that's always been the core of how I build on top of that for DevOps. So I would look at the tools and like, what benefit do they bring me in kind of bringing in the human kind of improvement? I don't see that being reported in that way. So it's usually the other way. Like people say, well, you know, if everything's working, life is more happy. But it's kind of like, you should start in a way, like from the opposite, like, okay, what do I need to kind of like be more confident? Okay, that's like tests, like not being paged. If we fix this as a group. So that mentality of kind of like the health as the core of what we do is maybe like more of a bottom-up approach than like a top-down business who will say like, I need more money, like I need kind of like more efficiency. So both are kind of probably valid, because if a company is not making money, you know, it's hard to give you like a safe environment to work in as well. But again, and anyway, so on your question, yes, I like the SRE. It's more of the narrative. It's not like a mentality, but then again, SRE mentality at the origin is no different from DevOps, is no different from Agile, is no different from ITIL. They all meant to improve, them all meant to make things better. But what tends to stick is the practices that people remember around this. And SRE will be always like SLOs, SLIs, and kind of those practices. DevOps will be containers and config management and monitoring, and Agile will be TDD. And so every one of those movements kind of got reduced into a set of practices that people remember it for. But at the origin, they're kind of saying the same thing. So.
I mean, Patrick, we could have a whole session just on psychological safety and how it maps back to DevOps, you know, because I think some metrics like, you know, time to push something live really gets down to like, how confident do I feel in this? Like, because if you're unconfident, you spend more and more time in a test or staging environment.
Yeah. And the pressure, right? Even if you have that, like the pressure at work, is it like, do they understand if things fail or not fail? Like the most beautiful comment I ever got from somebody over an email saying, you know, thank you for DevOps. You changed my life. I learned that I shouldn't draw the short straw. Right. And in a way, I like that in a way that, like, you know, it drastically improved that person's life and its well-being. So that was like, okay, if I reach that for one person, hey, I'm done with it.
Yeah, I feel the same way. Like a metric like mean time to remediate sounds incredibly dry. But when you think about it, it's like, hey, I pushed something out, it's broken, and I'm not up all night trying to fix it. I'm not paging 6 other people. I can just safely do that, which is like this immense relief.
Yeah, definitely.
But the actual metric sounds incredibly dry.
But imagine you would like have that metric like the other one, like deploys a day, and you're not ready, right, to do this. Like it's like it doesn't tell you anything. There's this concept of, if you go to a party, right, and you would measure the number of interactions during the party, would that tell you it's a better party? No. Like there's no indication on the quality itself. So the fact that you're pushing this out and you're kind of doing this, but it could be, but again, you probably need several different indicators, and then you kind of have to understand like what are the humans behind it, whether that like matches the model that you're measuring. Otherwise, you're just generalizing a measurement like we're all like machines and we can be replaced, and all our workflows are the same across, you know, the whole world, and that's not it. We all have a history. We all have, like, you know, as much as we want to hide it, like we have states in companies, in humans, and we cannot like kind of ignore that in a way.
Yeah, I mean, you talked earlier about, I'm paraphrasing grossly, so I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Any metric can be gamed by an engineer. So like if we incent people on 10 deploys a day, they're going to do 10 deploys a day. They might just break up that deploy to make it smaller.
Yeah. Yeah. I think one of the mentions in the book was, which I find interesting, they nuanced this by saying the number of fearless deploys a day.
Yeah. So to go back to the book for a second, one of the case studies within the book was focusing on a company with a case of the almost done's, where batch sizes were always that little bit too large. How do you combat that?
Trying to express that into maybe more like software development, right? If your backlog always overflows, like there's always things moving to the next one, then some people really get upset. You never reach the deadline. You never do this, right? And I'm one of those people who like things like Scrum and estimations in a way that it gets you a conversation starter. But again, I don't like if they're taken as a goal and a metric, and it was never intended that way. And so this kind of batch size of, we have 5 features and now we have 3 features, like there's too much variance in this for a lot of the cases. I think that relatedly, I think it was Google who made a presentation about AI ops, that they're trying to figure out in the logs like whether a system should behave or something. And they always come back to the same problem. There's too much variance in all the cases. We can't do it. And that means we need to collect more data, which we can't at a certain scale. And that predictability is just hard in some cases. I think the clue is to standardize, right? And then you can maybe estimate a little bit better. But I think the overall problem is that we try to cram 100% utility. I think it is a number, but if you probably estimate for 80% utility, you would have a much better life and a better flow. So the batch sizes are one way to introduce, kind of influence your flow, but it's also kind of the variance, reducing the variance of the batches will probably also be one of the ways to do it.
Patrick, I feel like we could talk for easily like the rest of the day. I have 2 final questions that I'm going to turn it over to Q&A. The first question is actually something that I care a lot about. I'm CEO of a 400 plus person company. You often talk about how leaders need to live their values and demonstrate them to their teams. What's your advice on how managers and leaders can genuinely know that they are doing this?
That they can know how? Can you repeat that, please?
That leaders need to live their values and demonstrate them to their teams. How can managers know that they're living their values? What's a good feedback loop for that?
Oh, okay. It's a tough one.
Question.
It's a tough one. So it's not really how you measure this, but it's definitely surrounding you with people who don't agree with you in a way that it's like diversity of opinion. I know you as the loud person still have kind of the last say on things, but having multiple voices in your head that are whispering, it's kind of like it's important. And at least that opens up feedback, right, of different opinions. The second one is probably not dismiss or like not have the urge to jump in against other voices, which is an urge which is pretty hard for CEOs. Like, I think it's like this, and your opinion is multiplied by 50 compared to all the others. If they just say, I just have an opinion. In that way, I found another approach is almost like filtering your opinion by proxy. But that gets out pretty quick, like who your proxy is. But I think it's like supporting other people in their opinion. Like, what do you need? Like, I'm not saying yes or no. Like, what do you need? Kind of that opinion. It doesn't give you the feedback, but sadly, one of the best ways to get feedback is whether people are leaving your company, yes or no. Because if they feel frustrated after a while, they are not being heard. It seems they're not adding value, or like, you're not appreciating them in a while. That's hard. But it is one of those scaling problems as a CEO, right? So have more of a nuanced kind of a soundboard that gets you this feedback. Don't jump into each of them. But yeah, what would be your advice? Like, I
was trying to make it general to any manager. It's a tough one. Like we talked earlier about metrics, but it really comes down to people.
Yeah.
So I have one final question before we turn it over to the Q&A. Simon Wardley said that DevOps is dead. I kind of disagree. But what do you think is exciting about the future of DevOps?
Let me say, I don't disagree with him. And my nuance is, and I think what he's trying to say is that people have started equating DevOps with certain practices. Like I mentioned before, Agile with TDD and so on. So people will equate it like we're doing containers or we're doing this. And that's kind of how, people think this. And this will eventually move. Like, things will get abstracted. There's going to be different practices. So in that way, I agree with him that like, if you have the narrow view on the technology point of view, DevOps is kind of like probably shifting, right? The shift that I'm personally quite interested in the future, and which I've seen already more and more, like 10 years ago, we had to convince companies to do DevOps. In a way, like not convinced, but it could be one of the solutions, right? Or like different way of thinking. Now they're saying, we're doing this. So where will our bottleneck move now? And I find it interesting in the way that I, for example, I see more and more like the platform team is now taking care of this. Like, so how are you treating the platform team just as the former ops team, or yes, no? So we kind of build a new silo somewhere in the middle to buffer, which is interesting how that's going to play out on, is it really going to be heading for a new bottleneck or a kind of new silo that we're building? And then the other kind of new shift, like if you say like, oh, we've done this pipeline and all that stuff, and we have autonomous teams. The next part is like, how do these autonomous teams still work together if they're so autonomous? Like I see people getting afraid of like, oh, we really can't tell them that, they should do this. Like they're autonomous. And I think that will settle again by having some form of more of a central goal, or kind of at least kind of a way to bound them back to the groups together, because otherwise they'll be drifting off. I think it's like the tragedy of the commons. Like, if nobody's taking care of the central thing, then everybody can do whatever, and eventually it ends up being like, the land's been taken advantage of, and so it's not really working. So those are the things that I would see. It's not per se that DevOps as a mentality will evolve in a way that, look, it's a bottleneck, but the bottleneck will shift because we've changed our organization in the companies. And it'd be interesting to see what new kind of like friction points will emerge and how we need to address those new friction points in a way.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's funny, like I started my career when Agile was still new.
Mm-hmm.
And then Agile became very regimented. To the point where, like, I remember Kent Beck, I was on a mailing list around lean startups. He's like, Agile is not it's capital A now. I always want it to be little a.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and maybe some reading. I personally, one of my favorite books to think about collaboration forms and in new ways is Reinventing Organizations. Maybe the term has come up like teal organizations, but I don't want to like focus on that term, but they kind of show you the hierarchy, how things have built up. Like first, we needed to take away the fear. Like, that's kind of the castles, like we moved away from the castle metaphor. Then we said like, oh, let's automate. That's the factory metaphor. And then we moved on to like, oh, but the factory, now we can measure everything. That's more like the industrial kind of way of thinking about, oh, measure, oh, yes. Then they moved on to the service. But guess what? Like, we all start with like, we're a great service. And then all of a sudden we know where our customers are and who pays the bill. It's like, oh, you're our service and you're not our service. So we kind of shift away. But the last point they kind of made is like this collaborating teams and autonomous teams. And what I found fascinating is that they put only one rule there. And the rule was like, if one team is doing something, they always have to ask the other teams, what is the impact? And that seems like almost like a universal rule. Like whatever you're doing, ask for the others for feedback on the impact, and then reevaluate again. And I can see that being valuable in autonomous teams, that we're not operating in a vacuum where we're only focusing on ourselves. That's kind of the simplified life. But in essence, we always have to keep thinking about like what's the impact of things we're doing. So
yeah, autonomous teams, but in a service-oriented architecture.
Yeah, definitely.
I mean, Patrick, I really feel like we could just sit and talk for the next 4 hours.
Yeah.
But there's some questions from the people who've called in. And before we turn it over to the Q&A, I just want to say thank you again. I absolutely loved chatting with you.
It was a pleasure. That's good questions. So thank you, Edith. Appreciate that.
Thanks so much, both of you. It's really great. I loved how we arrived at the how to live your values point, and we're tying in both of our comments. And I know we're talking about putting on a Christmas jumper jokingly before the event. I genuinely got cold, so this is not I'm not doing a bit, I promise. So we've had some excellent questions come in the chat. So first we've got one from Anastasia Efremoska from bol.com. Is there any new principle that you've discovered since the first edition, or a principle that you've changed your mind on?
Well, for me, that was more of the extension of DevOps outside your company, like the suppliers, finance, HR. That was for me kind of the discovery, in a way that they all have pipelines. Sales has a pipeline, legal has a pipeline. They're all trying to get early feedback. They're all trying to measure things. And for me, that was kind of maybe like probably a discovery in a way that we could still learn so much from other fields and we've been so focused on the technology. So that would be my personal discovery on this. So
nice. Edith, have you got like a favorite principle or practice that you've found that you've like shifted your view on, especially since scaling Lauchdarkly?
I mean, my biggest one is just learn and grow. Which I think is bigger than DevOps, but just you're always learning, you're always getting new knowledge, you're always growing, you're always trying an idea. Maybe it doesn't work right now, and maybe it'll work 2 years from now. And that's why I really liked Patrick's comment about autonomous teams and then getting feedback from other teams.
Yes, definitely. I was doing some work on on chunk-based development, looking at the kind of idea of testing as being its own form of feedback loop, and I could go on about that, but I'm going to stick to the timing. We had a great question coming from Maximilian Siffart from Otto, and he was kind of talking about how to internal education around DevOps and the accumulation of responsibility. So he said here, when I think you build it, you run it, you monitor it too, how can I make the point in conveying what the intention of the term of DevOps is? And I found that to be quite an interesting overall topic. It's got to be really difficult to sell people on the entire philosophies.
Yeah, so I think one of the things I wrote in the new book, and like it's taken me a long time to kind of like say what's in and out for me on DevOps, and kind of my what's happening.
I think one person coming off on mute, but I think we should be able to. Okay. So go ahead.
Okay, so I kind of distilled it very narrow, maybe like or broad narrow to this. Like, DevOps is what you do to overcome friction created by silos, and then all the rest is engineering, right? And like, there's a lot of practices we could do, but if you're doing it because you're bridging a gap, and I keep like coming back to this when people say, hey, we did this Kubernetes thing and it's all great. It's like, okay, did it actually improve something for the others, or like did you help
my end? Yeah, it'll be saying
overcome a problem?
Hey, Kenver, can you come out?
Sorry about that. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, so again, it's like why you're doing something. Like, are you automating it just because you like automation, or are you automating this because you're overcoming a gap, or providing information, or helping somebody to do their job better? And for me, that's kind of like the difference between where I would draw the line on this. So
it's funny you bring up that quote. Actually, I think that was Nigel Kirsten was delivering a talk on the latest Puppet study on the state of DevOps, and he brought up at the intro when I was chatting about that the term that you often get given as the godfather of DevOps. He mentioned that you were sometimes often a bit tired of hearing hearing that. Is that still the case? Are you?
I'm not the person that likes to be the idol up front of stage, so I'm probably the person who will talk from the back a little bit. I think there's two ways to interpret the godfather. There's some people that might interpret it like, oh, you had like a big say in things, which is, I had like this tiny part helping somewhere, like, and I never say I kind of like invented or anything there. Like, I helped a lot of getting the stories out, so there's that. But I think the other way of more of the godfather, and I think I interpret the American way, is in a way that you kind of like with your children, you're kind of like the godfather. Yeah, you mean the best for them. And I think I did my share on that. It's kind of like, nurture, help people, kind of like help those people, resonate the things they say and connect people there. So in that way, I'm not tired of that. But on the first, of course, like, I don't want to be like, I'm not the person in the spotlight. It's like, I always say it's like zeitgeist, like Edith says, like you have to be there at a certain point, and that happened, and it happened to be me. Right. But it's not that I had like this insanely mind. It's been a privilege, though, to watch something from small to grow something that big on the world. So it's like insane to see this impact. But, I'm a Belgian. We're like this tiny, like little thing. And so we can't like have anything special on us. So.
I was going to say, we actually haven't spoken too much about DevSecOps as well, around your kind of your latest role. I wonder if that's something. Well, let me quickly ask. There are a couple more questions in there that have come in from the attendees, and so one of them from Luke Jones at Neighbourly says, would you have any advice for DevOps engineers who want to start focusing on developing and driving more of a lean culture within the development team rather than just fulfilling the technical side of the role? I think you kind of did focus on some of the aspects of giving.
It's a question I often get, like, how do I get bootstrapped? And they're getting annoyed that they want to do DevOps and the others do not want to do DevOps. And the advice I give them is that don't mention DevOps. Just ask the problem they're trying to solve, which is your bottleneck, and then see if there's any way you can kind of help them. And that's how you get started. But a lot of them kind of get hung up. It's like, I want to do DevOps, but basically they're saying, I want to play with Kubernetes and containers and blah, 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 right? Which, in a sense, like in the learning spirit, I fully agree if they want to go that route. But it's always like, who are you helping and what's the problem you're helping with? And if you shift your focus to that, then your impact will kind of, and conversation will stop. In my previous company, nobody said I was the DevOps person. So kind of they kind of vaguely knew, but it wasn't that important because we were just shipping stuff and helping each other. So anyway, I try, if the term gets in your way, don't even mention it. So.
Would you agree with that, Edith? Would you like maybe just don't mention the term and just focus on lifting up your team?
Yeah.
What was your big slip?
I think it goes back to what we talked about earlier, that sometimes a term gets overloaded. Like, I think most companies now are doing some form of Agile and it's not even mentioned anymore. Like, it's like, of course you have a sprint, of course you have a Scrum. These are Agile technologies or functions, but you don't say we're Agile because everybody's Agile. And I think with DevOps, I think it's very similar. It's like if the term gets in your way, it's a mistake. I think also sometimes people get very caught up in tools and lose track of what they're trying to do. Like, let's spin up 9 months to build everything into microservices and containers instead of, hey, what problem are we actually trying to solve? Which I think is me just repeating what Patrick just said. So thank you, Patrick.
Maybe to add to this, like, for 10 years, there's been a cry for a definition around DevOps. And I think at the first DevOps days, I always shied away from this. Like, I learned the 10 books of ITIL didn't solve the problem. I learned that the 1 page of principles of Agile didn't solve the problem. So I kind of said, like, if I'm going to nail this, like, really hard by definition, it will not flourish and we will not keep expanding the ideas. The flip side, obviously, anybody new to the domain will get like 15 different opinions. And that, I understand that can be confusing for people, but at the same time, it drives people to have listened to 5 opinions and then kind of see what helps for them. So I'm like, it annoys me that, we could nail it better, but at the other hand, I'm pretty happy we didn't. So the book is probably the best middle ground.
It fits with one of the great problems that we face in computing and technology anyway. Naming things is hard.
Yeah, definitely.
I think we have time for maybe one more question. So we've got Ivor Matic from Adidas asks, talking about delivering value versus automating everything, what do you think about the flow framework for visualizing how well my DevOps is working? I guess that's really kind of tied back to what you've just mentioned around sticking to the terminology. But I guess when it comes to mapping value streams and making that really visible and clear, like, do you have any tips?
Not specific, besides being a fan of people doing it and kind of visualizing it. I wouldn't say I'm anywhere the expert on this. So, him being at Adidas, I've seen some talks that they've done pretty great at that level. I think one of the persons there is Dominica de Grandes, who talked a lot about that as well, making stuff visible. So that's, but probably already knows that. So, but for other people, that's a really good tip. That's, coincidentally, she worked also with people working on Kanban, like David Anderson in the Agile world. And so making these things visible. Again, it's like one of my favorite exercises to make that visible for the team. But how the team makes that visible, like, it can take many forms. Like I've seen people put sweets at the end of their sprint, so they celebrate to make things visible. I've seen people using Legos. I've seen people using kind of different ways. And actually, as such, it doesn't matter, but probably the fun factor anchors it as a way that people are like doing it and making this visible as a flow. And like Edith says, like, just a graph that has MTTR is very dry. So it's like the wins. Maybe one addition to that, I recently saw an extension of this where, people would use badges. And I'm not a big fan of badges in a way. on the individuals, because again, like it can generate this kind of pseudo behavior that you're going for the badge and not kind of really doing it. But a nice exercise I found is that when they completed something or like they did something, they had like a group head, and the group head had all the badges. So it kind of tied it back that we're doing all of these benefits for the team in a way that it's not the individual contributor, which also should get the credit. I'm not talking about that, but I found it the nice way that, you know, it's a group effort in this as well.
I always quite like when there's that sort of bridge between hardware and software with those kind of solutions. Where I think it's actually the second edition where there's one case study which talks about a platform team that rig up a set of lights and one of the wavy inflatable to signify important outages. It's a good way to make things very visible.
Yeah.
Edith and Patrick, do you have any final remarks or questions that you wanted to, I guess, end on before we jump into our breakout rooms and discuss all the points we've just talked about?
Well, Patrick, you first.
My point is that I'm a big fan of learning, right? Keep learning, but don't be dogmatic about whatever you read. Try to think about your own situation and what helps. But then at the same time, don't dismiss something if you're just doing it once, because you might not yet understand what you're doing. So it's kind of go both ways. Like try a couple of times, and then reevaluate, but don't get discouraged on the first time. I think there the thing is to find allies, right? Like-minded people who feel the same pain, people who want to solve this problem. But that's general or generic to all change management that you want to drive in a company. So.
Yeah, so I got into DevOps from the lean startup methodology of, you know, as the moderator of the lean startup list. And I saw a lot of people saying, how can I iterate more quickly? And DevOps was part of that. I think one of the biggest challenges, though, and Patrick, you said it precisely, was if you're not pointed at the right problem, DevOps isn't going to solve that. But what it can do is help you figure that out faster. In terms of, you know, I'm releasing features, they're getting to the market, they're not getting to the market, at least being able to iterate very quickly instead of the old way of doing it of like a 10-year release, which doesn't work.
Yeah. Here.
To wrap it all up, you know, learn and grow, learn quickly, iterate quickly, solve problems. And Patrick, I loved our discussion, and I hope we get to do another one soon.
My pleasure. Definitely up for that.